Cannabis has been unfairly demonized for most of the last century, but things are starting to change. In recent years, more and more countries have begun to decriminalize or even legalize it. Most recently, Germany. And with good reason. Compared to legal substances like alcohol, which is expected to cause 1 in 20 deaths globally this year, cannabis is relatively mild. The harsh laws and penalties it faced were built on exaggerated claims about its dangers, but in the rush to undo past mistakes, a new problem has emerged. Public conversation has swung so far in the other direction that many people now see cannabis as almost entirely harmless, even beneficial in all cases. We've contributed to that overly positive image ourselves. Part of the issue is that, for decades, strict laws made it extremely difficult for scientists to study cannabis, especially its long-term effects. Research was blocked by legal and bureaucratic obstacles and limited to small sample sizes. But that's finally starting to change, and some of the new findings aren't easy to ignore. Cannabis, while still far safer than alcohol, has a darker side. It turns out to be more addictive than previously believed, and frequent long-term use can lead to serious issues. As we've gathered better evidence, it's become clear that we need a more honest conversation. Not about whether cannabis should be legal, it should, but about the reality of what it does to the human body and brain. Cannabis is a drug, with unique pros and cons. It deserves to be treated as such. The key ingredient that makes cannabis psychoactive is THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which binds to cannabinoid receptors in your brain. This alters how you feel and process information, creating a wide range of sensations. The higher the THC concentration, the stronger the effect, and people are increasingly drawn to stronger experiences. In fact, the market reflects this demand. In the US, Canada, and much of Europe, THC levels in both legal and illegal products have more than doubled in recent decades. Potent strains are being bred, and products like edibles, oils, and concentrates can now contain over 60% THC. Low THC options are steadily disappearing. Unfortunately, the higher the THC dose, the more intense the side effects, and most of the problems associated with cannabis get worse. At the same time, more people than ever are using cannabis. In 2022, for the first time in US history, more people reported using cannabis daily than drinking alcohol. In Canada, about 26% of those aged 16 and older use it, up from 22% in 2018. These increases aren't necessarily caused by legalization, though. Usage trends were already rising in the 1990s and 2000s, long before legalization became widespread. What matters today is that more people are consuming more cannabis more frequently, and the products are stronger than ever before. One of the most misunderstood issues is addiction. For years, the belief that cannabis wasn't addictive went largely unchallenged, and for most people, this still holds true. About 8 in 10 users can enjoy it casually with no significant consequences, but around 2 in 10 develop what is known as cannabis use disorder, CUD. It includes a range of symptoms: an inability to stop, using despite harm, developing tolerance, and going through withdrawal. At its core, it means using more than you want to, even when it's no longer fun or helpful. There are 3 major risk factors for developing KUD: how much THC you're consuming, how often you use cannabis, and the age at which you started. The earlier and heavier the use, the greater the risk. Roughly 1 in 10 users become seriously addicted. These individuals often use cannabis daily, and their lives begin to revolve around it. They may spend much of their time using or recovering from use. Because of tolerance, they need more THC to get the same effect, so they switch to stronger strains or consume higher quantities. Research has found that chronic cannabis use is linked to a range of emotional and mental health problems. Users may feel irritable, anxious, paranoid, or even depressed. In many cases, people use cannabis to relieve these symptoms, only to find that the drug actually makes them worse in the long run. It becomes a vicious cycle. There's also a notable connection between cannabis use and loneliness. People who feel isolated may turn to cannabis to feel better, and over time, cannabis use can increase social withdrawal. This feedback loop can lead to emotional isolation and chronic loneliness, even if the drug initially made things feel more bearable. Heavy users also report a dulling of emotions. Cannabis affects the brain's reward system, making everyday life feel less stimulating. Boredom becomes tolerable, even pleasant, and people may spend their time simply killing hours with passive entertainment. But boredom is a natural signal. It pushes us to learn, grow, and engage with life. When it's constantly muted, personal development can stagnate. This emotional dulling can make quitting very difficult. Life without cannabis might feel flat, unmotivated, or boring. That, in turn, tempts users to go back to the drug, even if they know it's holding them back. The longer you've been using, the more intense this withdrawal can feel. Quitting also brings physical symptoms. For heavy daily users, withdrawal can cause headaches, sweating or chills, decreased appetite, nausea, abdominal discomfort, and sleep issues. Some people report vivid dreams or even mild fever. Emotionally, quitting may trigger mood swings, anger, anxiety, or a deep sense of meaninglessness. These effects typically begin to fade after a few days and may last up to a few weeks. And then there's the bigger question: does cannabis cause permanent damage to the brain? The answer isn't clear yet. Some studies suggest that THC can change brain structure, particularly in areas responsible for memory, attention, and decision-making. Some of these changes may reverse after quitting. Others might not. What's known is that heavy users often experience impairments in focus, impulse control, and learning. Though these effects usually fade over time if cannabis use stops. Younger users are especially vulnerable. Those who start using cannabis heavily in their teens face a much higher risk of addiction and long-term mental health issues such as psychosis, schizophrenia, anxiety, and depression. Early use is also tied to lower academic performance, poorer life satisfaction, and reduced ambition. It's not always clear whether cannabis causes these outcomes or simply correlates with them. But the risks are significant enough to take seriously. None of this means that cannabis is inherently dangerous or should be illegal. For most adults, occasional and moderate use is relatively safe and far less harmful than alcohol. But if we're going to treat cannabis like a normal part of life, we also need to treat it with the same seriousness as any other drug. It has benefits. It also has risks. For some people, those risks are real and life-changing. So if you're thinking about trying cannabis, it's worth waiting until you're older, ideally into your 20s. The science makes it clear that this is a safer time to explore. There's no rush. The highs aren't going anywhere, but neither are the consequences. Cannabis has been vilified for nearly a century, but it's finally being decriminalized in more and more countries, recently even legalized in Germany, and for good reason. Compared to legal substances like alcohol, which is responsible for 1 in 20 deaths each year, cannabis is relatively mild. Much of the justification for criminalizing it was based on exaggerated fears and misinformation. However, there's been a shift in public perception, and perhaps we've gone too far in the other direction. If you've followed the conversation over the past few years, you might think cannabis is all upside and no downside. We've even contributed to that narrative ourselves. But here's the problem. For decades, criminalization made scientific research difficult. Researchers faced serious bureaucratic and legal hurdles, often working with small, limited samples. That's finally changing. More comprehensive studies are being done, and the findings are not great. While cannabis is still far less harmful than alcohol, it's not harmless. It turns out it's more addictive than we thought and can have significant negative effects, especially with long-term or heavy use. The primary psychoactive compound in cannabis is THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which binds to cannabinoid receptors in the brain, altering how we think, feel, and perceive the world. And THC levels are rising. In the US, Canada, and Europe, both legal and illegal cannabis products now contain more than double the THC concentration of past decades. Potent edibles and concentrates with over 60% THC are now common, while products under 15% THC are becoming rare. Unfortunately, nearly every negative effect of cannabis use worsens with higher THC doses. At the same time, usage is increasing. In 2022, for the first time in US history, more people consumed cannabis daily than alcohol. In Canada, 26% of people aged 16 and older reported using cannabis, up from 22% in 2018. Legalization may or may not be the cause. Usage was already climbing before laws changed. So now we have more people using more cannabis than ever before, and it's stronger than it's ever been. What does this mean? A long-standing myth is that cannabis isn't addictive, or if it is, not seriously so. That's true for most users. 8 out of 10 people use it casually without issue. But around 1 in 5 develop a condition known as cannabis use disorder. This includes symptoms like using more than intended, failing to cut back, developing tolerance and withdrawal, and continuing use despite negative consequences. In short, using too much, too often, even when it's no longer fun or beneficial. The main risk factors include high THC doses, frequent use, and starting young. About 1 in 10 users develop serious addiction, often using daily and experiencing significant life disruptions. These users may feel